There is a moment, and you have had it, where you are standing inside a life that works, and something in you wants to take it apart. Not in the way that dissatisfied people want different lives, not the fantasy of moving to another city or changing careers or leaving the relationship for someone who makes you feel something again. Those are renovations. What you feel is older and less civil than renovation. It is closer to arson. You look at the structures you have built, the schedule, the reputation, the careful management of how you appear to the people who depend on you, and something underneath all of it says, what if I just didn't? You have learned to treat this as a symptom, evidence of ingratitude or instability or some private deficiency that responsible people don't have. You push it down and return to functioning. The moment passes. You go back to being the person your life requires you to be. What you have not done, because the feeling moves too fast and because looking at it directly seems dangerous, is ask what it is actually pointing at. That is the question this script exists to ask. And the answer is not the one you're bracing for. Erich Fromm made a distinction that most people who reference him ignore. He wrote about two fundamental orientations, not personality types, not diagnostic categories, but underlying modes of relating to existence itself. He called them the biophilous and the necrophilous character. Biophilia, in Fromm's usage, is not merely a love of nature. It is an orientation toward what is living, growing, uncontrolled, generative, toward process over product, toward becoming over having arrived. The necrophilous orientation, by contrast, is drawn toward what is fixed, controlled, certain, dead, in the sense of no longer subject to change. It is the character that prefers order to life, because life is always threatening to exceed the order imposed on it. Fromm was writing, in part, about political systems, but his clinical insight was that the necrophilous orientation is not a character flaw so much as a developmental outcome, the predictable result of an environment that rewarded control and punished mess, that valued product over process, that treated the vital and the volatile as problems to be managed rather than forces to be inhabited. Here is where it lands for you. The life you have built is a monument to control, not control in the petty sense, not micromanagement or rigidity. Control in the deeper sense, a life from which uncertainty has been largely evacuated, a life where the outcomes are predictable, the relationships are managed, the future is legible. This is what functioning looks like. This is what responsibility looks like from the outside, and none of it is wrong. But Fromm's clinical observation was that a life organized entirely around control is a life in an ongoing suppression of something that does not want to be suppressed. The impulse to burn it down is not evidence of ingratitude. It is the biophilous current reasserting itself against the necrophilous structure you've spent years constructing. That is not permission. That is a location. Jung would have approached the same phenomenon from a different angle, and his angle is sharper. Jung's concept of the shadow is frequently domesticated in popular psychology, reduced to your dark side, or the parts of yourself you don't like. This domestication is a kind of malpractice. The shadow, in Jung's actual argument, is not a collection of negative traits. It is everything that did not fit the self you decided to become. It is the entire excluded range of the psyche, the desires that were incompatible with the life you were building, the impulses that would have complicated the identity you were constructing, the capacities and orientations that were left outside the circle of what you allowed yourself to be. And here is the piece that most treatments of the shadow miss because it is uncomfortable and does not resolve neatly. The shadow does not stay where you put it. It accumulates, and it communicates, not through conscious thought, through pressure, through the dreams that leave a residue you can't account for, through the irritability that has no apparent cause, through the attraction to people who seem to be living in a way you never permitted yourself to live, and most relevantly here, through the inexplicable and recurring desire to dismantle what you have so carefully assembled. You think the destructive impulse is the opposite of who you are. It is the most honest report you've received about who you are in years. The content of the shadow is not random. It is not chaos for its own sake. The shadow accumulates specifically from what was sacrificed on the altar of the constructed self. If you built a responsible life by learning to suppress spontaneity, then the shadow carries spontaneity, distorted by years of suppression, into something that looks less like delight and more like destruction. If you built a competent life by severing from whatever was perceived as weak or needy or inconvenient, then the shadow carries exactly that material, the vulnerability that was never permitted to be simply vulnerability, transformed now into a pressure that the constructed self cannot metabolize. The destructive urge is not asking you to destroy your life. It is asking you to account for what building it cost. This distinction is the one that matters, and it is the one that is nearly impossible to make in the moment of the impulse itself, because the impulse does not arrive labeled. It does not say, "I am the grief you bypassed in year 4 of building your career." It says, "Blow it up." And the gap between that message and what it is actually trying to communicate is where people make catastrophic decisions, not because the impulse is wrong, but because they engage with its surface rather than its source. Hannah Arendt wrote about what she called the banality of evil, the observation that the great moral catastrophes of the 20th century were not primarily the product of monsters, but of people who had stopped thinking, who had become so functionally integrated into their social roles that the capacity for genuine reflection had atrophied, who were, in a very precise sense, absent from their own lives. Arendt's argument about thinking is not a compliment to introspection. It is a demand. She was not describing a contemplative practice or a therapeutic process. She was describing a moral obligation, the obligation to remain genuinely present to the meaning of what you are doing, to resist the slide into automatic functioning, to keep asking what your actions actually mean in the full human context in which they occur. The opposite of thinking, in Arendt's sense, is not ignorance. It is the smooth, unexamined operation of a person who has become identical with their social role. The reason this applies here is not metaphorical. It is structural. The life that generates the destructive impulse is often a life from which genuine thinking, in Arendt's sense, has been progressively evacuated. You become so occupied with executing the responsibilities of the constructed self that there is no longer any space in which to ask whether the constructed self is oriented correctly, whether the structures you are maintaining were ever actually chosen or simply inherited and then optimized, whether the life you are protecting is the life you would build if you were building from what you actually are rather than from what the circumstances required. The impulse to burn it down is not a demand for destruction, it is a demand for thinking. And thinking, in this context, is the thing the constructed self most urgently resists, because thinking introduces the possibility of change, and change, if she threatens the structures that have been built to make the future predictable. Nietzsche described the will to power not, as the popular caricature would have it, as the desire to dominate others, but as the fundamental drive towards self-overcoming. The capacity not just to endure one's existence, but to actively shape it from within, to become the author of one's values rather than simply the inheritor of them. And what he observed about people who had not done this, who had built lives from inherited values, social expectations, the unexamined accumulation of others' definitions of the good life, was that they were living at a tension that would eventually demand release. The tension he described was not between what you want and what you can have. It was between what you actually are and what you are performing. The person who has built their entire self-concept around responsibility, around reliability, around being the one who holds things together. That person has, in Nietzsche's terms, not overcome themselves. They have subdued themselves. And subdued things do not stay subdued. They find pressure valves. The destructive impulse is a pressure valve. But here is the complication that Nietzsche's framework introduces, and it is a real one. The self-overcoming he was pointing toward is not liberation in the sense of release. It is not the permission to follow the impulse, to let the pressure valve blow, to burn the life down and call it authenticity. That is not self-overcoming. That is simply a different form of being governed by what you haven't examined. The impulse, followed blindly, does not bring you closer to the self that was buried. It creates new damage and then a new structure built around managing the consequences of the damage. You would be starting over, not arriving somewhere. Self-overcoming means bringing the suppressed material into contact with consciousness, not acting it out, but examining what it is carrying, what it is pointing toward, what it has been trying to communicate through the distorted language of destruction. This is significantly harder than either suppressing it or following it. It is harder because it requires you to hold two things simultaneously that the constructed self is organized to keep separate. The knowledge that the life you have built is genuinely yours, genuinely good in important ways, worth maintaining. And the knowledge that building it required exclusions that were real losses, not temporary inconveniences, and that those losses are now pressing for acknowledgement in the only language available to them. Viktor Frankl wrote about the space between stimulus and response as the location of human freedom. The clinical version of this idea is that the gap can be expanded, that with sufficient awareness and practice, you can insert genuine choice into the space between what happens and what you do. Most applications of this idea focus on the obvious direction, widening the gap to prevent reactive behavior. But the gap runs in both directions. The destructive impulse is a stimulus. The question Frankl's framework poses is, what happens in the space between the impulse and the action? For most people in this position, the answer is nothing useful. The impulse is either suppressed immediately, because that is what the constructed self does with threatening material, or it is followed through fantasy, the mental running of scenarios in which everything is burned down, which provides temporary relief, but also, crucially, further distances you from what the impulse is actually carrying. The fantasy is not engagement. It is another form of avoidance because it focuses on the surface of the impulse, the destruction itself, rather than the information the impulse is trying to deliver. What Frankl's framework suggests, and this goes one step further than his standard applications, is that the space between the impulse and the action is not merely a pause. It is the only location in which the impulse can be interrogated. Not managed, not suppressed, not indulged, interrogated. What specifically does this feel like it wants to destroy? Not in the abstract, not everything. Which part? The career, the relationship, the version of yourself that shows up in specific rooms. And when did this particular structure become the thing you wanted to eliminate? These questions are not comfortable. They are designed not to be comfortable. They are designed to extract the signal from the noise, to find out what the shadow is actually carrying before you decide what to do with it. The shadow is carrying specific content. This is important. It is not a generalized rage against your existence. It accumulated from specific sacrifices made at specific moments for reasons that were probably good enough at the time. You made choices, and the choices had costs. And the costs were not fully processed because there was no space in which to process them, because processing them would have required pausing the construction of the life you were building, and the construction could not be paused. William James wrote about habit as the flywheel of civilization, the great stabilizing force that allows human beings to function without having to consciously decide everything from scratch. The habit of the constructed self is a flywheel. It keeps the life running with minimal friction. And flywheels, once established, are extraordinarily resistant to changes in direction, not because they are inherently opposed to change, but because the mechanism that makes them efficient is the same mechanism that makes them difficult to redirect. The destructive impulse feels from the inside like the desire to stop the flywheel by any means necessary. And the reason it takes that form, rather than a gentler, more surgical form, is that gentle surgical intervention is invisible to a flywheel. You cannot whisper a flywheel into slowing down. The shadow, which has been whispering for years and being ignored, has escalated to shouting. The shouting is not evidence that the content is destructive. It is evidence that the whispers were not heard. James also argued that the self is not a single, unified entity, but a collection of social selves. Different versions of you that operate in different contexts, each relatively coherent within its domain, but without any necessary continuity between them. The person you are in your professional context is not simply a restrained version of the person you are in private. It is, in some sense, a different self, constructed differently, governed by different rules, maintaining a different relationship to its own history. The constructed self, the responsible, functioning, reliable version, is one of these social selves, and it has in many cases become dominant to the point of suppressing the others. The destructive impulse is frequently a message from the social selves that have been subordinated to the dominant one. Not a desire to destroy the dominant self, but a demand for redistribution, for the dominant self to cede some of its territory, to allow the subordinated selves more room to operate, to stop treating the entire interior life as raw material for the project of functioning well. You think the destructive impulse is an intruder. It is a tenant you forgot you had. Epictetus made a distinction that is sharper than most contemporary formulations of the same idea. He separated what is up to us from what is not up to us, but the sharpness of his version is in where he located the boundary. It is not, as popular versions suggest, a distinction between internal and external, between attitude and circumstance. The distinction Epictetus was drawing is between what proceeds from your own reasoning and values, what is, in the deepest sense, your own doing, and everything else. And by everything else, he meant not just external events, but also your own unreasoned impulses, your automatic responses, the behavior generated by the unconsidered self. The destructive impulse in Epictetus's framework is not up to you in the sense that it arrives without your consent and has force independent of your wishes. But your response to it, what you do in the space between the impulse and the action, is entirely up to you. And the range of responses available to you is determined by how clearly you have thought about what the impulse is. If you have thought about it not at all, the only available responses are suppression and enactment. If you have thought about it carefully enough to identify what it is carrying, a third response becomes available: engagement without action, acknowledgement without compliance, holding the impulse at sufficient proximity to extract its content without being governed by it. The Stoic tradition, of which Epictetus is the most rigorous practitioner, is often reduced to a philosophy of endurance, of tolerating the things you cannot change. This is a misreading. The Stoic project was not endurance. It was clarity. The clarity required to know what is actually yours, what you are actually responsible for, what you are actually capable of shaping, and the even harder clarity required to know what you have been treating as yours that is not. What burdens you have been carrying that belong to the structure rather than to you. What choices you have made on behalf of a constructed self that was never quite accurately described as you. The destructive impulse will tell you, if you let it, which parts of the construction were genuinely chosen, and which parts were simply accumulated. The parts it wants to destroy are almost always the latter. This is not a distinction that can be made quickly. It requires a quality of attention that the flywheel does not naturally permit, which is why the first practical problem here is not psychological but temporal. Where in a life that runs at the speed of its responsibilities is there room for the kind of interrogation that would extract the signal from the impulse? Most people answer, there isn't room, and they are describing something accurate about the structure of their lives. What they are not examining is who decided there wasn't room and in whose interest that decision operates. The constructed self has a significant interest in there being no room. The constructed self is a structure, and structures are self-maintaining. They generate exactly the busyness and urgency required to prevent the kind of reflection that might lead to their modification. This is not a conspiracy, it is what structures do. They reproduce the conditions of their own maintenance. So the question is not whether you can find room, it is whether you're willing to take room, to interrupt the flywheel deliberately, to impose a pause on the functioning that the functioning itself will tell you cannot be paused. To treat the destructive impulse not as something to be resolved before getting back to normal, but as a legitimate demand for the kind of thinking that has been absent. Camus would have resisted every formulation in the preceding paragraphs that sounds like a promise. He wrote about the absurd as the irreducible tension between the human demand for clarity and the world's indifference to that demand. And he was rigorous about refusing the consolations that most philosophies offer to resolve it. No transcendence, no synthesis, no eventual arrival at a stable understanding, just the ongoing obligation to remain honest about the collision. Applied here, you will not, at the end of the interrogation the shadow demands, arrive at a clear picture of who you really are underneath the construction. The self that the shadow is pointing toward is not a stable, pre-existing entity that was simply buried. It is something that has to be assembled from the material the shadow is carrying. And that assembly is not a single act. It is an ongoing practice, imperfect and revisable, and it will not produce the clean resolution that the constructed self would prefer. What it will produce is something harder to describe and more valuable, a life that is more accurately yours. Not a different life necessarily, not the life that results from burning everything down. The same life, or something close to it, inhabited differently, with more of the excluded material in contact with consciousness, with less of the structure maintained at the cost of suppression, with a smaller gap between the person who shows up in the responsible contexts and the person who remains when the responsibilities are put down. The destructive impulse will not go away. It is not supposed to go away. It is a permanent feature of being a self that has been built by a process of exclusion, which is to say, it is a permanent feature of being a self at all. No construction of personhood is complete. Every self is made from what was included and what was left out, and the left out material retains its charge. What changes when you engage with the shadow rather than suppress or enact it is not the presence of the impulse, but its quality. It becomes less urgent, less operatically destructive in its register. It begins to function less like a demand for total demolition and more like a compass, a persistent pressure in the direction of what is being insufficiently attended to. Not because destruction would help, but because that is the only language available to a self that has never been permitted to speak more quietly. The question worth sitting with is not whether you should follow the impulse. That question, answered either way, misses what is actually being asked. The question the impulse is posing, the question underneath the surface noise of it, is whether you're willing to find out what it is made of, whether you're willing to conduct an honest inventory of what was buried in the process of building, and whether some of what was buried deserves to be recovered rather than simply managed. You built something real. That is not in question. The question is whether the person who built it got to come along.